All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. As you just all learned, I'm Arielle Wittenberg. I'm the water reporter with E&E News. And this panel is to talk about the federal-state partnership and how that relates to the Everglades restoration. It's been almost 20 years since President Bill Clinton signed the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP, into law. And it's the biggest, most expensive environmental restoration project in history, meant to restore the natural flow of fresh water from Lake Okeechobee into the Everglades and Florida Bay. Of the 68 projects that make up CERP, just 8 have been authorized by Congress and are moving towards completion. Our panelists come at this from all sides of the issue. I'm going to try to introduce you in the order that you're sitting in. Okay. So we have Joe Benz, Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Army for Management and Budget. U.S. Representative Brian Mast, who also sits on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Water Resources and the Environment. Noah Valenstein, Secretary of the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and Joe Negrin, President of the Florida Senate. You almost sat in order how I had written you down. Supporters of the Everglades restoration have 2 main priorities. For this year at least. One is the EAA reservoir that Senator Nelson just spent some time speaking about, and that the state of Florida just submitted that to the Army Corps for approval. The second priority, as always, is budget and funding, and we're going to talk about the reservoir first. So, Secretary Valenstein, why don't you briefly explain sort of the purpose of the reservoir and why it's important to the Everglades restoration?
Sure. So, I'll start with, we're so excited about the movement we've seen in Everglades restoration over the last 10 years. I think Eric started us out this morning talking about, for decades, we'd had projects on paper, but we didn't have them in the ground. We hadn't turned dirt. And so as we move forward with restoration strategies, which was the core set of projects to ensure we have the clean water needed for Everglades National Park, and then started adding on all those projects that had been on paper, but we hadn't started turning dirt, and we started having success with those on the East Coast with C-44, on the West Coast with C-43. Again, only starting in 2015 on the east side and 2016 on the west side, emboldened us to demand more. And that, I think, happened right around the same time when you heard so many people this morning speak eloquently about the impacts to their livelihood, the discharges it had with algae, water quality, all while Florida Bay was being also starved for clean water. And so that emboldenment of our stakeholders, that desire to always do more and to see the success we have had over the last 10 years ended up with a consensus to move forward with the Everglades Agricultural Area Storage Reservoir, knowing that that was going to be the key element to work in concert with all the other investments we've seen to eliminate discharges or eliminate the harmful elements of discharges, more than 60% of the flow out to the estuaries, and really take that next step forward to guard the Everglades for future generations. Okay,
great. Now, the state of Florida undertook this proposal in an expedited time frame. Can you tell us why you chose to go this way, and if there's any lessons you've learned from this process that could be used in future projects?
Sure. The reason we took an expedited process was urgency. Right? The Everglades is the foundation. Our natural resources are the foundation for our economy here in Florida. And with every success we've seen, again, and I say emboldened, and I think it's been the success begets success. And we've seen such success, again, moving from decades of projects sitting on paper with citizens having to see water quality not moving, to now having seen the C-44, C-43 set being authorized in 2016. And that made us realize, and we've seen the best water quality on record this year in the Everglades. And that makes us all want to do more. For the very same reasons, again, you heard today, is the challenge is not gone, right? The challenge is there. We see it and live with it every day. But we have seen the success and the ability we have when we have a steady funding stream and dedication and stakeholders working together to move forward.
And any lessons learned from this process, or is it too early to tell?
No, I would compliment the Corps. It's been a new process, the first time we've done it this way, and all along, while I think we probably have learned the lesson of the more communication, even though it's in the state's hands to begin with, it is a team project, right? That it's not just a state process now, because we did did it this way. It is still a team process. So the more we can still communicate all the way along, and I think we've been working as we go to sort of take those notes so that next time we'll be even more improved. And I commend the Corps for pointing out ways we can improve and ways they can improve. And so that continued communication would be the key element I'd point to.
Okay, great. And Mr. Benz, I understand, like we were just talking about the expedited process. This is just one of a few projects, I believe, that have used Section 203 of the Water Resources Development Act of 1986. Explain to us what makes this process different.
Well, 203 actually, Section 203, what it does is it allows local interest, the non-federal interest, to take the initiative to initiate a study, as in the case of what the team has done here. And that's exactly what they've done. The South Florida Water Management District put forward a feasibility study, the post-authorization change request, to address, as the gentleman said, the storage, the conveyance, the treatment of the water in order to improve the habitat function. So why it's important is, again, the subject of this panel that we're here for is that symbiotic relationship between local interests and the federal interests. And Section 203 allows the local interest to take that initiative, take that first step to move forward with feasibility studies.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so the Corps now has 180 days to finish your review. I believe that puts us in October.
I'm tracking September 26th,
okay.
Not to be too specific, which, as I said, they initiate an expedited type of study. So we're trying to ensure that we certainly meet the 180 days and maybe even expedite that review as well.
What does your review consist of? What are you looking for?
So at the headquarters level, it's a general review to ensure the study was done in accordance with administration policy and general feasibility. Will the project, as described, work as intended, and does it make sense? But also the local district office, in this case Jacksonville District, will do a review of the environmental compliance type of issues.
Okay. And you said you're going to make the 180-day deadline?
Well, I'm on the budget side, so I'm speaking for our chief of project planning and review, but his team's certainly fully engaged.
Okay, great. And Congressman Mast, you're on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee working towards a new Water Resources Development Reauthorization Bill. Assuming the Corps does meet their 180-day deadline, is this project going to get into WRDA this year?
So WRDA is going to occur prior to us getting that post-authorization change report back, in all likelihood. So one of the things that we're looking to do is to put a marker inside of the WRDA bill for that, basically reserving a spot for that. So that's probably one of the important ways that we can do this. There's a couple other ways that we can work around this issue, and I don't know if you're going to get to it, but a broader issue of just new starts in general and what goes on with that in Congress that is really, you could call it a self-inflicted wound that Congress imposed on itself when trying to go out there and get these projects moving that we're partnering with at state levels. So one of the other places we're trying to work on this is to say, let's create a revolving fund for Everglades projects for the United States House of Representatives to put those dollars in specifically so that the Corps can take and draw upon them immediately and not necessarily have to wait for the next WRDA bill or the next WRDA bill and be tied to the way that we might do things every 2 years. So that's one of the other places we've looked at trying to say get resources in the place that we need.
Okay, so what's the timeline you're thinking on a House WRDA bill? If it sounds before September 26th, it sounds like.
Absolutely. I would be very surprised if you didn't see that House WRDA bill prior to September 26th. In all likelihood, I think you're going to see it probably before the 4th of July.
Okay. And is this something, it sounds like something that you've talked to leadership in the committee, Chairman Graves of the subcommittee and Chairman Schuster about in terms of finding a way to include the reservoir?
I wouldn't say that I've spoke to them. I would say that I've harassed them endlessly about this. I think you got to look for the right battle space to do things. It's not an accident that I'm on transportation and infrastructure. It's not an accident that I'm on water resources and environment. Those were the best places to go to work for this project that affects the home of myself and Senator Negron so very directly. I think it's one of the big reasons you've seen so much of the work that we've done put into this, and we want to see this brought to fruition. So in that, this is where the eggs in my basket go, is to get these projects brought to authorization, brought to completion. And then if need be, one of the things that I look at personally is what goes on in the next Congress. If we can get the authorizations that we need, do I move to the appropriating side? And that's one of the things that I consider is potentially moving to the appropriating side on the next Congress so that we can get the dollars and get them to follow on the authorized projects.
Okay, great. Senate President Negron, your hometown of Stuart, Florida, was one of the most affected, by the algae outbreaks a few years ago and releases from Lake Okeechobee. So one of the biggest challenges for the EAA reservoir is convincing members of Congress who don't represent Florida that this is a national priority. Given that you had to do something similar, convincing other folks from other places in Florida that this should be a priority. I mean, what are your tactics? What can Representative Mast kind of steal from your playbook here?
Well, I'll defer to him on the congressional side. He certainly got much more experience and background in that. But on the state level, I really see it as kind of a twofold process. Yes, you have to make arguments in the process, and I think some of the arguments that we made that were ultimately successful. One that I made was that if you take a line across the northern boundary of Lake Okeechobee and just draw it across the state of Florida, 40% of Floridians, or more than 8 million people, live south of that. So it's a huge regional issue that doesn't just affect discharges coming to the Caloosahatchee and discharges going out to the St. Lucie River and the Indian River Lagoon. So that was an argument. Secondly, it does affect tourism. I mean, one of the things that makes Florida an attractive place to visit, and we had 136 million people visited our state last year, and we have over 300,000 people moving into Florida every year. And people have choices on where they're going to spend their vacation funds or where they're going to decide to live, and they're choosing Florida. And my view is, even if they never go to the beach, even if they never went to the river, to an estuary, the reputation of Florida as being a peninsula surrounded by water, where our rivers are clean, our lakes are clean, our springs. We're not a state that has been tagged with the pollution label. And I think that's very important to our entire image and our brand as a state for tourists and for future residents who come to Florida from all over the world. So I think we were able to make that argument. Another argument that I made, particularly with some of our friends from the panhandle of Florida, is when we had the Deep Horizon oil spill. I happened to be President Don Gates was Senate President at that time, and I was his appropriations chair, and this is before he was had taken that position. Within I think 24 hours of that occurring, I was in my Jeep in Stuart, Florida, driving to the panhandle to see what was going on. And I walked those beaches, and I went through the empty hotels, and I saw firsthand businesses that went under, people that suffered. And as a state, we responded. And there's litigation that was settled, but separate and distinct from that, there were things the state did to address the harm economically, financially, and reputationally. Because people in New Jersey or New York or Washington State that want to come to Florida, they're not going to say, well, it's okay, I'll just go down as far as Stuart to the beach, but there's oil all over some beaches somewhere else in Florida. That's not the way it works. Our whole state would have taken a hit. So those were the arguments that we made. And even though I'm a lawyer and I believe in arguments, if I have one thing I want to leave today, arguments will only get you so far in this process. At some point, someone has to say, I'm not leaving until this gets done. If you want your things done, then my things are going to get done. And it has to be a battle of political wills with people that are going to say, this is going to happen, or else other things aren't going to happen. Because, for every argument I just gave you, I can give you 10 whack-a-mole arguments that the other side made on why we shouldn't do what we did. So ultimately, it really came down to people. Anything that gets accomplished in the political process is ultimately a person does something, says something, writes someone, calls someone, engages. And the reason we were successful is we had an incredible group of people. Kim Mitchell sent people from our communities to come to our meeting rooms in Tallahassee and our committee rooms to testify. Jackie Thurlow-Lippisch, who's on the Constitutional Revision Commission in Florida, she started a group of river kids who came and testified in Congress and came to the Capitol. I mean, we just had so many people. Mark Perry, who's been involved in these issues for many, many years. And then on the technical side, Anna Upton with the Everglades Foundation was incredibly, really indispensable in doing the technical and legal blocking and tackling and monitoring to make sure that this all stays on track. Nick I. Rossi was very helpful in strategy. And then the last person I'd mention, just because we were always being hit with that the science isn't there. Whatever we wanted to do, they would do. I want to do everything else but that. So we were constantly having to justify what we were doing, even though this has been agreed on for 2 decades, and it's hardly revolutionary. It actually makes common sense. Water is coming up into the lake. It gets so high that it's going to flood and harm people, the 30,000 of our fellow citizens who live in Clewiston and Belglade and Pahokee, who I care about. I represent Pahokee. I grew up going to those communities. I'm a native Floridian. I understand that things don't show up in Publix in the green thing with the cellophane wrap. I understand the importance of agriculture, and I respect that part of Florida. So the lake is going to get so high that it could flood and harm or kill people. So they didn't think about this before they did all the stuff, and so now they came up with this idea that we'll just flood estuaries and ecosystems east and west. This makes no sense. I mean, I talked to 4th and 5th grade science classes. They look at you like, that was the plan? Was the lake was going to either kill people in the glades, or you were going to man-made draw things, and you were going to flood Indian River Lagoon and the Caloosahatchee and Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel. That was the plan. That was the plan. So I'm not the general manager of the university. I can't undo history. I have to live within a framework. What we can do is say, you know what? Let's build a reservoir south of the lake that at least will take, as you were saying, 60 or 70%. It's not going to solve every problem, but it will dramatically help so that we have a place for the water to go. It's not a bathtub. It doesn't go there and just sit. It gets the water, it's storage that is vibrant and keeps going and is dynamic, and then the water eventually goes south. And ironically, they actually need the water south, which is another irony. So we did have good arguments. But in the end, when you're taking on tough political battles, people have to post up, go underneath, decide you're going to block someone out, and you're going to get a rebound. That's how it has to happen. And if you don't have that dedication and commitment that we had in our community, both in Southwest Florida and the Treasure Coast and all over Florida. And then the last people I want to give credit to, and I had another appointment so I didn't hear them speak, but I saw their bios. The fishermen and women and the corporate interests that support them, that provide there was literally, those of you in politics will agree with me, and you can't explain it's subjective and it's ethereal, but it's true. You can feel momentum in a process. You just can. And you can feel when this is going nowhere, it's dead on arrival, it's a non-starter, it's on life support, so you feel that month after month. When the men and women who are with the fishing industry and the corporate side, and we employ tens of thousands of people. This is our business. When they came to Tallahassee and made the rounds and visit, it was a measurable effect in our side. So I've gone to Orlando to their convention to thank them publicly, but I want to thank them one more time because they were a very big part. And none of this would have happened without Eric Eichenberg being there every day. And thank you, Eric. And going through all the undulations of the process.
Great. Well, that was actually a very good explanation to add on to Secretary Valenstein's about why the reservoir is needed. And now we're going to move on from the reservoir and talk about appropriations and budget, because even once this project, if it makes it into WRDA, is authorized, someone still has to pay for it. So why don't we start off with Mr. Benz? Can you, and I know this can be complicated stuff, but briefly explain to us how the Army Corps develops its budget requests and how the appropriations and authorizations kind of fit into that.
Okay. So the development of the budget, challenging for sure. But essentially the way it works is our office, the Assistant Secretary of Army for Civil Works, we work collaboratively with the Corps of Engineers headquarters level to prioritize projects for funding in the budget. They develop that budget from inputs from their district and division teams that identify the projects, the requirements, the capability that they have to deliver on those projects. And the reason I say it's a challenging process is because we all know there are more requirements than there are resources. We work with a top line sort of level as identified by the administration. And that top line is also identified into different appropriations, whether it's construction and operation and maintenance, investigations. But then again, we work collaboratively around the table with the Corps of Engineers leadership to identify what those most critical projects are. How's that done? Performance-based, essentially, which projects deliver the best benefit for the investment. But again, a collaborative process to try to get there.
Okay. Now moving to the Everglades specifically, when Congress passed SERP back in the Clinton administration, lawmakers envisioned $200 million annually as the federal contribution, but multiple administrations have consistently requested less than that in their budget requests. Is the Everglades a priority for this administration?
Well, it's definitely a priority for the administration, and that's been stated. It's also it is somewhat evident in the funding level. I realize that we'd love to have more than what is necessarily appropriated each year. But again, it's back to the competing priorities, and across this nation, there are a lot of important projects that need attention. And again, frankly, the requirements outweigh the resources. However, the commitment has been there. Again, you can have arguments or discussion about at what full levels to fund Everglades work at, but in the ecosystem restoration area, we've been. I think the numbers are running around $80 million or so per year, but also in Herbert Hoover Dike, you talked about Lake Okeechobee, Herbert Hoover Dike a little bit, sir, and there's that is a priority for sure, and funded at a level more in the $200 million range. You're looking at FY19, so I do think the emphasis is there.
Okay. And the Florida Everglades Restoration Project is one where there's a cost share, so the federal government pays however much Congress ends up deciding, and then Florida also contributes. And some have said not just for this specific project, but generally that the Corps should be giving priority to projects where there is a cost share and where the federal government isn't just footing the entire bill. Is that something that the Corps agrees with?
I don't necessarily speak for the Corps of Engineers. I think you have to strike the balance of, because I work for the Assistant Secretary, I think you have to strike that balance of when does it look like folks are getting themselves to the head of the line by either accelerating funds, but the concept of a project sponsor and having somebody with skin in the game, I think, is supported, yes.
Okay, now Senate President Negrin. As I mentioned, Florida has obviously invested billions of dollars in the Everglades restoration over the past decades, and has committed to spending billions more. So what does it mean to the state of Florida? How important is that federal investment in the federal cost share in that?
Well, I mean, it's determinative. It's indispensable. We can't, there's not going to be a reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee if the federal government doesn't pay for half of it. And that's one reason why I made it a goal of mine during my time as Senate President that we were going to do everything on the state side to make that happen. And I think Congressman Mast is ideally positioned with his committee assignments and his expertise and I know is working diligently to make that happen. But I didn't want to hear excuses. Well, we can't get federal money because we don't know. Our thing is done. It's law of the land. It's signed into law. It's $800 million. I put $50 million extra just in case there were some overruns. I hope there won't be. So we don't have to do anything. Nothing has to happen in Tallahassee. $800 million is funded. It's in our budget. So all we're asking is that the federal government put up their half of those funds under SEP, which is part of the agreement, and I'm optimistic that they will. And we're prepared as a state, if the Army Corps approves the project during this 180-day period, we're prepared as a state to start on the project at the end of that time and wait for the federal money to catch up. Because the one thing that's we will lose support for all of this is if we delay and do nothing and people don't see actual things happening. That's what I told my constituents when I started on this. I said, I'm not promising to change the world. I'm not solving every problem, but I'm going to promise you reasonable, measurable progress that you can actually see and verify. So I think that's why we've been successful. If I can make just two other very quick points. I am not a scientist. I got a B in biology in college, barely. And I just want to thank Tom Van Lent, because we can all agree or disagree with opinions, and your opinions are no more righteous than mine. But there are some facts in the world. There are some things that are actually yes or no and right or wrong. Science is one of those areas. And I will say, and I worked on this issue for many years under enormous pressure, and I never had a situation where Tom Van Lent's science was ever called into question or invalidated, and that gave me a lot of security knowing that we were on solid scientific footing. So, Tom, I want to thank you for everything that you did. And then the last thing I want to mention is complexity is a tool that is used for people who want you not to get what you want. This budget system is not complicated. I chair the Appropriations Committee in the House and in the Senate, and other than the numbers in Washington are multiple times our budgets, and the fact that we can only spend money we have, they can spend 20% more than they have by borrowing money from the Chinese government and doing other things. So, with due respect to Washington, and I'm a state person, it isn't that complex. Someone is going to get funded. You know what the budget is? It's a piece of paper with numbers on it. If your numbers are on there, they think highly of your project. If your numbers are not on there, I don't care if you had a good meeting. I don't care what you were told. Here's what they think of your project. Nothing if it says 0. If it says half of what you asked for, they think it's only worth 50%. Ultimately, and I give the Army Corps credit, what they have done in rehabilitating the dike is amazing. And as a person who is not a technical person, when I go out and see just the fact of how they get this equipment out there, how they build these culverts and install them. And Governor Scott asked us to, and we did. We put $100 million, $50 million last year and $50 million this year. We're not obligated to. We have no duty. That's a federal project. They run it. But we said, you know what? We want you to work with us, so we will, on our own, with no strings attached, here's $100 million to expedite getting the dike completed. And I give the Army Corps great credit for their technical expertise in doing that. That being said, there's somewhere in some place in this city, I don't know where it is, there's going to be a piece of paper and it's going to have the reservoir. And they're either going to put $750 million into it or they're not. And if they don't, the only reason they're not is because somebody at some high level decided that it wasn't as important as something else. So, yes, we have to follow all the rules, and I know there's OMB and there's this group and that group, but be respectful, talk to people, listen to, everyone has input. I know when no one person decides, but it ultimately comes down to, are the ultimate decision makers in this town going to support us getting that reservoir, or are they not going to? And I actually am very optimistic, and I know Eric and you and I had a chance to talk about this. I think we have made so much progress with the Secretary issuing the administrative order, approving everything, and the Secretary's been amazing and supportive to what we've done as a state, to everything that's building nationally. I think we're on the right track, and I'm very optimistic. But I think we all just have to keep pushing until we can get over the final goal of success.
Right, and Secretary Valenstein, we're talking a lot about money and numbers and millions and billions of dollars. Give us a sense of what that means on the ground in the Everglades. If you get the money, if you get half the money, if you get less than half of the money, what does that mean for the ecosystems and estuaries that everyone here cares so much about?
So I wish that was a theoretical question, but it's not, right? I mean, we've seen it, we've lived it. again, 10 years ago, I remember being in a situation of struggling for funding of $5 million for Everglades in Florida. Again, projects weren't being built. The conditions that we have seen and so passionately talked about today are the byproduct of that, not funding Everglades restoration. And so we have seen it, we've lived it, and thankfully, again, through partnerships, again, from folks in this room gathering together and saying this isn't an issue in which there are sides. You know, everyone is for Everglades restoration. This is critical for Florida's economy, Florida's way of life. This will happen. It has to happen. And when we had that approach of, and again, it was sort of, to Governor Scott's credit, I remember him very clearly saying, you know, we're not going to invest in litigation. We're going to invest in projects. You know, let's get folks in the room and state the goal. The goal is clean water going to the Everglades. The goal is restored Everglades. Let's get folks in the room and let's have them work on a partnership and move to investing in projects as opposed to litigation. And that's what we've seen. And that's what we have to continue to do. Because the answer to your question of what does it look like if we don't fund Everglades restoration, what does it look like if we don't have a joint goal moving forward, we know all too clearly. It means projects won't be built. It means we'll have a tidy stack of papers on the desk. And it means we won't have the water quality we want. And thankfully, because the last 8 years now, we've seen what it means to build projects, clean water, progress, new projects being authorized. And so again, we have to use every opportunity to have a success, push us towards that next success, and embolden us to do more.
Okay, great. Congressman Mast, I wanted to follow up with you. You mentioned potentially a revolving fund to get around this no new starts idea. Can you talk a little more about that, either as it relates to the reservoir or obviously more broadly for Everglades restoration?
There's a lot of Corps of Engineer projects, and so there's also Senator Negron brought up OMB, Office of Management and Budget, who gets involved in a lot of these things. When the federal government puts a limit on the amount of new starts that you can have each year, obviously that can affect any one of these projects that we're trying to get done. So if we can take, at the federal level, put those dollars into a bigger pot that says Corps of Engineers, you manage this how you need to, instead of having to go to OMB each time that you want to ask about something, we've made the process that much quicker. So it's one of the important ways I think that we could kind of thread that needle at the federal level. It's one of the approaches to that. One of the other approaches is just asking, saying, hey, we want an appropriation for $750 million. That's one of the ways to ask it. You know, one of the other ways is what do we do through the water bill? One of the other places is, and I like to have more than one option, and that is to say, I don't speak for the president, I don't speak for the executive branch, but all of the guidance that we have as we're working through what could be a very large infrastructure package is to say priority is going to be given to where there is a state match to those dollars that we're putting the federal dollars into. The state has made their commitment, and these projects are 100% infrastructure project. These should be no-brainers to say, let's put that federal match into these projects, whether it's under what we classify as a large infrastructure package that has been talked about for some time, or whether we classify it as something that is part of Everglades restoration or a WRDA bill or whatever other place you want to. There's options to get the dollars out there, and we just got to get one of them over the finish line.
All right, so you and the other members of the delegation, some of whom spoke earlier today, some of whom are speaking later today, kind of all of this right now rests on your shoulders as members of Congress. This is a similar question to what I asked Senate President Negron, but what's your pitch for your colleagues who aren't from Florida, maybe only go to the beach every once in a while in Florida, and that's their Floridian experience? You know,
I'm always fond of the phrase, there's no holds barred, or there's no such thing as a fair fight. I couldn't tell you how many of my colleagues I see on the flight headed down my way constantly, week after week, month after month, and it's an easy time to make the case to each and every one of them. That water that you're flying over, that water that you're going to go sit on, that water that people that you know there live on top of, those are all the things that matter to me. This is why we're fighting for this. This is what we're looking for here. So that's one of the easy places that we go, and we make that fight. We make that pitch to them. Hey, don't be worn out with this project, because let's be honest, sometimes representatives from other states and other places that want their Corps of Engineer projects funded and brought brought to completion, they get worn out with Florida asking for money. That's one of the things that we encounter. So we got to keep them excited about it and got to let them know that this matters to people that matters to them as well. And so that's one of the other things that we let them know. I'm very positive about us getting the funds for this project. I think that we're going to get it over the finish line. Most important or most positive on this because of what I said already, and that being the guidance for us doing an infrastructure package. A different piece has been we want to give priority to where there's already that state match sitting there, so that we can so that we can compound those dollars. That is this situation right here. This is a situation that makes sense for all of Florida from top to bottom, and I think we're going to get it.
All right, great. Well. So last question, and any of you can answer this one. Folks in this room tomorrow, I believe, are heading up to the Hill themselves to lobby people like Congressman Mast and ask them to support the Everglades. What's your advice as folks who have had to make the case in various forms?
I'd hit you on some of that. Number one, bear in mind the places that you're going to. When we talk about water, algal blooms that affect the Treasure Coast or the west coast of Florida, these are not just Florida-specific problems. There are representatives from across the country that care about those exact issues as well. They can really wrap their head around what we're trying to deal with in Florida, and a lot of them probably want to retire in Florida at some point. But you look at what goes on in Lake Erie and Lake Michigan, down at the base of the Mississippi River, and so many other places. These are folks that can easily wrap their head around the issues that you're talking about. The chairman of my subcommittee, Garrett Graves, he's from Louisiana. He gets algal blooms 100%. One of the biggest things that he works on for his district. So when you talk about the way that Everglades restoration fits with the kidneys of Florida and Lake Okeechobee and the Kissimmee River, discharges to the east and west coast of Florida and everything else, these folks get it even if they're not in our area, and speak to them at a high level, relate to how it is for things in their state, and I think they're going to be sympathetic to you, in my opinion, and in the way that I've seen it played out. So,
I would say, time and time again, we've seen in Florida that when you spend the time to build a partnership, focus on a joint goal, have that unity of message, your project moves so much more quickly and you see so much more success. And so I think the more you can highlight, one of the amazing things we have in Florida is this broad-based partnership to restore the Everglades. Talk with one voice, be passionate about it, explain what it means personally to you. That's what's made us successful in Florida, and that's what will continue to make us successful.
Anyone else?
I don't really have any advice in that regard. So.
All right, well, I think that's it. But thank you, everyone, again. Can we get a round of applause for the panelists for joining us? Do we have any questions from the audience? And speak loudly, because I don't know if there's... Oh, there's a microphone.
Senator Negron is so eloquently pointing out the united front that he had to get Senate bill passed. 50 years that I've been watching state government in Florida, I've never seen a legislative leader who literally laid his body on the line and said, we're not leaving here until we get this bill passed. There were lots of cross currents. There were a lot of places where things could have jumped the cracks. But he kept everybody on a single-minded mission. He got that accomplished, and I can just tell you from my heart, it wouldn't happen without Senator Negron's leadership and the
Thank you. Senator Negron, I'm a businesswoman from the Gulf Coast side of the state. I wanted to ask you what you thought, or rather what your recommendations are going to be for the next leadership of the House in Florida and the Senate. I know that we have good representation both from Sarasota and from Miami. Both areas are affected by this Everglades restoration issue.
I think that we've accomplished the major goal that we needed to by getting the funding accomplished and getting the law changed. So I think we're really in a maintenance and monitoring stage. And so in the end, we had broad bipartisan support for what we achieved. Governor Scott and his entire administration have been very supportive. The Water Management District's been helpful. So my short answer is to just continue to monitor because we don't know what the state's economic condition will be. Hopefully it'll continue to improve as it is now. So I think that Senator Galvano as the president designate and obviously Jose Oliva as the speaker designate, both of them are important, but also budget chairs and sub chairs are also critically important as well. So I think the best thing we can do is monitor and always keep our eyes out for any potential efforts to undo what we accomplished.
Congressman Mast,
Sir?
I just wanted to ask you this while the gentleman on your right is here. It's my understanding that the Army itself can put the kibosh on the Army Corps' recommendation to do something. So are we missing a link in this chain? Are we not paying enough attention to the Army itself?
That's not a link that we've ever discussed, not to say that anything should be overlooked, but there is a series in this process where we're looking for authorization change from the Corps of Engineers. We're looking to put this through WRDA. We're looking to move that through the process, whether we have to write a specific bill for it to stand alone or put it in that Water Resources and Development Act. This is the way that all of the lawyers are telling us this will be the process for which you do this, historically speaking, and moving forward. And so I put a faith in that process and in the way that we're going about it. So.
Senators and Congressmen, I'm Benny Blanco. I'm a fishing guide in Everglades National Park. Specifically, I make my living in Florida Bay. Up until this year, maybe 90% of my year spent in Florida Bay. And this year, I'll probably be about 50% because of the water quality issues. I commend you on your fight in the state to get the reservoir approved. We were there every step of the way, and you amazed us, and we thank you for that. However, at the current prediction from the South Florida Water Management District, we're only looking at a 5% increase in water flow into Florida Bay. And I fear at the critical mass we are now that that won't be enough, and we stand to lose Florida Bay. So my question to you is, what is your stance on that, and how do we get to the point where we can actually build a reservoir that will work?
Congressman, do you want to? I'll jump in on the state angle, and if someone else wants to talk about the federal or some other aspect. The only thing I know to do is to continue to expedite what we're doing because we're on the right track. We're bridging 2.5 miles of Tamiami so that water can flow south and will ultimately go to Florida Bay. And we've done a lot of smaller projects to get rid of some of the obstacles for southern flow that I think will help. But you can only do so many things at a time, so I want to be truthful with you that my focus had to be 100% on the reservoir and funding it and getting it done. And I'll agree that once that's underway and construction's commenced and we have the funding in place, I think there are a number of other projects, including Biscayne Bay and other things that we need to continue to work on. But for the short term for me is I think completing the Tamiami Trail renovation so that we bridge and have water go south. I think that will do the most to get more water to the areas that you're talking about.
And I would, say, number one, thanks to all the captains that have gone out there. Y'all have done incredible work from Tallahassee to here. I've got to see you in both places. But I would touch on something that Senator Nelson pointed out. I believe I heard him mentioning it from the back room. You have to look at the growth of Florida as well, which has been absolutely explosive. It's projected to continue to be explosive. This isn't an issue that's going to be ignored. What is needed for, what we so often call the kidneys of Florida and the health of us just to have an economy that is supported by the need for water. I mean, there's been entire books that have been written about that the next wars will be waged over water. This is something that we end up having these fights within our own borders. And when you look at the explosive growth in Florida, I think that puts an onus on getting projects like this completed. It gets a lot more eyes on it than what people necessarily realize around it because of the scope in which it affects so many different people. So I hope you take that as a positive in the amount of eyes that are on this.
I think there were some in the back.
Hi, Congressman Mast. I was wondering if you could give us some insight into strategy on the problematic language addressing new starts for the Army Corps.
So some of the insight that I already mentioned was this. We try to work around that limit on the amount of new starts that they're going to do by, one, just saying we're going to authorize a bill for the Southern Storage Reservoir individually. We called that the Everglades First Act. That's one way that we could do it. We can do it through a revolving fund and working around that and saying we're just going to put the dollars in a pot, and if the Corps of Engineers takes that for another project, the Southern Storage Reservoir, then they can do that. Those are two of the big ways that we try to work around the new starts. I phrased it like this. It really is, it's a self-imposed wound that Congress didn't need to place on itself by any means. There wasn't any real requirement to go out there and do this. It's partially as a result of what no longer exists, which are earmarks. Earmarks no longer exist, which I think is an issue when you're talking about the Corps of Engineers projects. Because when you're talking about a Corps of Engineer project, you're talking about a project that the federal government has to go out there and authorize like this through the WRDA process to some degree. But then to say that we can't actually go ahead and put the dollars towards it, it's something that I think, especially in that circumstance, doesn't make sense at all, and it really brings us to a more broad issue that Congress has to have a discussion about, and that is, will there be earmarks? Will there be earmarks in any specific places? Maybe they won't exist in defense. Maybe they will exist in infrastructure or something like that. It's a big conversation that is constantly going on behind the scenes, and one that matters a great deal to the breadth of every Everglades related project that exists out there. Because if we could do that when we're doing at the time of an authorization, put the dollars towards it, it would be a much more smooth process on the end of it that I work on. But those are the two of the places that we're working on the workaround through new starts.
All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, Tori Linder. I'm a fifth-generation rancher from the Everglades headwaters. Based on what I saw last week on the Florida Wildlife Corridor expedition traveling from the Everglades headwaters to the Green Swamp, and the fact that our state's developing at a rate of 20 acres an hour, I'm sincerely concerned that the Everglades connection to North America is in question. Obviously, in 2014, 75% of Floridians voted in favor of Amendment 1, but we've only seen marginal numbers put towards Florida Forever. Senator Negron, what can we do to encourage our representatives towards the proper allocation of that funding?
Well, I think that the last couple of years, you've seen progress in that area. Senator Bradley, as the Senate Appropriations Chair, for the first time, we had significant funding for Florida Forever for the first time in many years, and we moved away from some of the using those funds for purposes that weren't directly intended by the voters. So I agree with you. I think we need to implement the letter and the spirit of Amendment 1, and I'm encouraged because as I travel Florida, I see a growing consensus to take care of the environment. It used to be when you heard the word environment, just take that word for a minute. What's your mental picture in your mind when you hear the word environment? To many people, that term meant anti-business, left-wing, don't like air conditioning, want to go back to the 1800s. What I see is that in both parties, and people of all income levels, education levels, there's a growing consensus that if we don't take care of, I was brought up in a very religious family, so we were taught that the term we use, you're stewards of the environment. God placed people, men and women here, to actually take care of the environment. You had this obligation, it was a religious obligation to take care of what's around. There's different motives, and people come to their conclusions through all different theories and philosophies, but the bottom line is I sense a very strong commitment from conservatives, from liberals, from people in the middle, both parties, that we have to take care of our environment, and they come at it from different angles. Jackie Thurlow-Lippis has got something on the ballot that's going to say no offshore oil drilling. Voters will have a chance to vote up or down on it, and the constitutional, we'll see how people vote. I'm not so sure you could have gotten a majority of commissioners from around Florida to vote for that 10 years ago. So the answer is money follows political will, money follows movements and where public consciousness is. And I think that more and more it's become so mainstream and so much of a commitment. We have disagreements on how to get there, but this is the best atmosphere politically, in my opinion, the time I've been involved in the state legislature to make environmental progress.
Right,
Can I just mention
yeah.
one last thing, which is, it's interesting to hear President Negron's comment about the budget process, and the comments about zeros and not zeros. So thank you, President Negron, and also thanks to the governor. We've got the largest budget, one of our largest budgets on record for the Department of Environmental Protection this year. And so I guess that means you liked it, and that was great. And so from climate change and sea level work that you funded to, we have more than $100 million for Florida Forever, 77 million of it, which is near a record amount, specifically to our Division of State Lands, for key work like you're talking about this year. And so where we stand right now, we've got a project before Congress to get authorized. We've got funding sufficient to make great things happen this year. And so I'm excited, and I hope together, we can really take advantage of that. So
Great.
Right, and I'm actually told we have time for 2 more questions, and the mic is already with one of our...
Sure, yeah. My name's Chris Whitman. I've been a fishing guide in Florida for 18 years. I'd like to first of all thank all of you for participating in the panel in the Everglades Summit. Congressman Mast, we've all come up here to meet with you and your delegation over the next few days. I think it's safe to say that you're probably going to see a lot more beards and baseball caps in Washington than you're used to. And I think that's a testament to the importance of the Everglades and of our estuaries to us, not just our businesses, but our way of life. I know that you get that. You understand that. You've been in the Everglades. You're from Florida. But I also realize the importance of your delegation and the other members of Congress to grasp that and understand that. I would like for you to keep in mind to utilize us and my other fellow fishing guides to invite your delegation, other members of Congress, to come visit us in our office. Come spend a day on the water with us and see what the Everglades is about. And I think that by doing so, the other members will gain an appreciation for what we're all working so hard to save. So thank you for what you're doing. And, the door's always open. Our whole team will do whatever we can to get you guys on the water.
Thanks for what you captains have been doing.
Last one, we got the mic coming around.
Jackie's really been raising her hand back there. I can see.
Thank you. I need to learn to sit in the front row. I'm Jackie Thurlow Lippish, and I think a lot of things happen when the stars line up. And seeing you all up there, the stars are lining up. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to say that something that maybe can help us tomorrow. One of my greatest memories of President Joe Negron, and he may have even been Senator Joe Negron at the time, was when he called the Army Corps of Engineers and asked them not to open the gates and for them to release the toxic algae onto our community. And they did. They stopped and they thought, and they ended up pulsing after that, so it wasn't as bad. But if Senator Negron had not called them, they would have just dumped it out on us once again with no thought. And I would say that, yes, there are other places in the United States, and Congressman Mast, I am a giant fan of yours. There are other places in the United States that have algae issues like ours, but no one in the United States has the federal government open the gates to release toxic algae onto their citizens. This must stop, and therefore we are a priority. God bless all of you, and thank you so much.
Great. Well, another round of applause for our panelists. And thank you for coming.